to try to do a video about why ghosts might exist. It's kind of a complicated topic, but I just did a video about the double slit experiment. I also talked about how our thoughts and how our intentions affect the world around us. It kind of gets into quantum physics a little bit, but quantum physics is a very complicated topic. I think I understand it fairly decently, so I want to try to simplify quantum physics and do a video and try to make quantum physics a lot more easy for other people to understand. So I understand that a lot of people don't believe in ghosts. There's a lot of unexplained things that have been going on in this world. In the last video I talked about how our vision is a very limited range, how our hearing, because we're human, is a very limited range. So there's lots of noise outside of our range that we can't hear. There's lots of visual range outside of what our eyes can actually see. Ghosts would fall into the category of things that exist, but things that we can't see because it's out of our vibrational range of what our eyes can actually perceive. From my understanding of quantum physics, we talked about how the double slit experiment basically proves that there is a aspect of atoms and molecules that we actually can't study and can't see. When a particle exists and it isn't being viewed, it acts like water. So it flows in waves. So basically that means it's a probability scale for each particle. Everyone has learned in school about bell curves and how bell curves work. Basically, you can think of each particle as having a bell curve of possibilities. Within that bell curve for that particular particle, you can look at any particular point to see if it's in that spot. It will actually collapse onto one possibility when you look at it. That's why when you're not viewing them, they're technically in all aspects. I mean, it's literally hitting every inch of the plate that's blocking it. At the same time, it's going through both holes. So in essence, because it's existing within that experiment simultaneously, it creates the interference pattern, because when one particle goes through one slit, that same particle goes through the other slit. So when they both meet on the back end of the plate, they interfere with each other, which is why they act like water. I showed how water goes through two slits, and because water literally exists in both holes, it exists behind the holes, it exists in front of the holes. When you create one wave and the wave goes up and hits the plate, it radiates through both holes as if both holes are separate. So then as both probabilities go through both holes, the water interferes with itself, and that's what creates the interference pattern in the double slit experiment. When you think of particles as water, that's the easiest way to understand that they are simultaneously existing in all possibilities at the same time. But once we break it down and look at that particular particle, so when we watch which hole it's going to go through, it realizes it's being watched, so it breaks down to one probability or the other. And as I explained, there's three possibilities. One is hitting the plate, one's going through the left hole, and one's going through the right hole. This is the only way that we can experience these particles and their wave function, because as soon as you go inside of their probability curve and you test them, like we said, they break down to one probability. So the bell curve is no longer a bell curve, it now breaks down to one choice within that variation of probabilities. The reason that this is important to talking about ghosts is because in quantum physics there's a theory that says since a particle has a bell curve of possibilities, that means not only one of the possibilities is existing, all the possibilities are existing. And that's where quantum physics comes up with a multiverse understanding of the world, meaning that if one universe exists, because that universe is inside of a probability curve or a bell curve for that universe, then that means all the other possibilities need to also exist inside of that bell curve. Because there's a saying, as above, so below. Basically what that means is when you have a probability curve on the tiny scale of particles, that probability curve is going to carry up to the massive. It's also going to continue carrying down to things that are smaller than particles. That's why the idea of as above, so below is so important, because you can almost think of our solar system as if it was, so our particular solar system has a certain amount of planets revolving around it, just like each single individual atom that exists. What makes an aluminum atom aluminum is how many particles it has spinning around the nucleus. So that's pretty much what determines the difference between one atom and the other atom. So since every solar system in our galaxy is a completely different entity, you can literally think of each solar system as a slightly different atom. So that means the energy inside of each solar system, since they all have different amounts of planets spinning around them, the planets are spinning at different degrees in comparison to the nucleus, hence the sun that's in the middle of them. So that's why every solar system has its own energy, because every solar system is completely different. So you can think of each solar system as being a completely different molecule inside of the massive major expanse of our universe. And the reason this is important is because when they do scans of our brain and they show all the neurons and the electrical and chemical impulses through the neurons, and when they map that out in our brain, they've done the same mapping of the entire universe, and they find out that the universe we live in looks like scans of our brain. So it's almost like our universe is a brain by itself and we're living inside of that brain. So that kind of makes you wonder, like, what universes can be living inside of our brains that are smaller than us that we are unaware of because they're so small. Now there's no way for us to gauge them. But anyways, with that being said, religion and spiritual teachers, they talk about free will. Now there's always been an argument between whether things are predetermined when you come into this life or whether you actually have free will. So people have been debating between the two, but science is now proving that they both can simultaneously exist. And I'm going to explain right now how they both do simultaneously exist. So I talked about how everything's basically a frequency. When we taste with our tongue, we're basically tasting chemicals that are in the foods that we're eating, but each chemical would have a different frequency to it. So just like an aluminum atom or a gold atom, each has a different frequency. Each individual particle in your food that you eat has a different frequency as well. So it's not like we're tasting chemicals per se when we eat something. It's more like we're tasting the frequency of it, because everybody knows that when we hear things, the reason we hear is because of frequency. When we're looking at stuff, we can see things and we see different colors because of the frequency that it's at. Now I'm sure everybody has seen a color palette on your computer. The color palettes used to be mixed up where they basically look like the rainbow. So you go from a color scheme of the furthest colors on the left to the furthest colors on the right. So then in between each color, which are your basic colors like Roy G. Biv, right? Those are the basic colors that we all know about, but each color blends in between. So you get a whole bunch of different shades of all of those colors in the rainbow. So everyone's seen those color palettes, but they've made the color palettes a lot more complicated now on the computers. So now instead of just going from left to right to get colors, now you can go from top to bottom to get different colors as well. A larger 2D model of the color scheme is what our computers use. The reason that this is so important to this discussion is because each color is literally a different frequency of the visual spectrum. So if you think of your hearing as being a frequency, when you're playing music, there's different frequencies to the sound. You can get a similar frequency, which is the same note being played, but it's an octave higher or an octave lower, so it sounds a little bit different even though it vibrates in a similar fashion. So that's how we currently get our music. Just how each piano has a different key that when you push it, it plays a slightly different sound, and then you can go up in octaves and you can go down in octaves, which also explains the saying as above so below, because when you get to an octave above and you still play an A, the A has a similar vibration, but the frequency is different because you're an octave above or an octave below that note. When you talk about quantum physics and you talk about different frequencies in music and different frequencies in the visual spectrum, you can think of the multiple universes being the same. So basically, a multiple universe would be like the book of paper. So on one page and on one side of the sheet, you have one universe, and then on the back side of the sheet, you have another universe, and then you have a whole bunch of different pages of the universes. So it's almost like this side of this page is one frequency, but then this side of that page is a different frequency. So they're close frequencies, but there's just enough difference between the frequencies that they're connected, but they're not really connected. And then the further you get away from that sheet, so the further you get down here into the booklet, the further you got away from the original frequency. So this might be the frequency that you're living on right now, and then this might be a frequency that you're living on 10 years ago. Every single time you come into a choice in your life, every single time that you were given a choice, if you chose choice A, you might stay on this side of the sheet. If you choose choice B, you might end up going to this side of the sheet. So it's close and it's overlapping, but it's a slightly different frequency. And I mean, as your choices change, or as you made a different choice, you get further and further away from where the original choice happened. So it's almost like through your life you're jumping through the pages, but these pages are pretty much infinite. There's possibly no end. Like, I mean, it's almost like this book is a bell curve for you, just like a particle has a bell curve of existences that it could exist in, and when you look at one specific instance of the particle, you find it in a specific spot. So the bell curve gets collapsed to one outcome, whereas when you're not looking, there is a whole bunch of outcomes. So it's almost like this book is your life, and it's a bell curve of the different lives that you could have. So I mean, all of these pages exist right now, and they've always have existed, and they always will exist. But the difference is which page are you going to end up on? Well, each page that you end up on is a variation of the choices you've made up until this time. So yes, you do have free will, but yes, everything has been predetermined. So even though you're living in a bell curve, I mean, not every possibility is possible for you in your life, but most possibilities for you in your life are possible. That's why it's a bell curve. So in the middle of the bell curve is the most likely types of lives that you're going to exist in, and that gives you the most possibilities, which is why the bell curve is peaked at that point, because that's the most likely lives that you're ever going to have based on the choices that you make. But then when you get down to the very outskirts of that bell curve, those are the probabilities for you, but they're the least likely spot that you're going to ever exist in. So it's almost like your consciousness that's living in your body right now has looked at a certain point of that bell curve. All the lives have collapsed onto that one particular point of all the possible existences. So the reason that this is important to understand ghosts is because if you're living on this page and let's say you die, just because you died on this page doesn't mean that you died on this side of the page or on this page or on the next page. So because you passed away here, you could still be existing in all these other places. You could be living in the same house on the first 5 sheets. So let's say you don't get into a different house until you're 6 sheets away, and then now you're living in a different house. Well, what happens is since each one of these pages has a different vibration, it's not like the vibration is completely consistent. So when you push the key on a piano, the key hits the string, so the string vibrates, but the string changes its vibration. So it'll vibrate at a certain consistency, but sometimes the vibration over time will slowly wane out till you can't hear that vibration anymore. With all these things vibrating, sometimes these sheets could get so close together that even though you're passed away in this reality, that this reality where you're alive might get close enough to this reality that someone might experience you somewhere in this reality, but what they're actually experiencing isn't the shadow of you. It's not the person that you were. It's the person that maybe you are on this side of the sheet. So maybe it's that the vibration of both realities got so close that you actually show up so someone can see you in a reality where you're not actually existing anymore. So that could be a possibility of why we encounter ghosts. Like, let's say there's a hospital in one reality, and in our reality the hospital's abandoned. Well, in that reality the hospital might not have ever been abandoned. It still might be in use. So when you go into that old abandoned hospital, to you it looks like it's been abandoned for a long time. It is decrepit, but in the other reality it is like brand new. So you could be experiencing entities from that other reality, and maybe the vibration just got close enough that you're experiencing it. Now some people say that they've been able to take ghostly encounters and they've been able to kind of pinpoint it down to one particular person that existed in the past. But I mean, since all these pages are existing simultaneously, and the only point on which page that you are going to be on at any given time is based on the choices in the past, because all these sheets are existing. So let's say this is your past on this page and this is your future on this page. So somewhere in between there is where you're existing. But if you make a different choice at one point, you can switch and basically go through the page to the next page, but then you'll be given a choice here and you might go back to this page, or based on that choice you might end up on the next page. So because all these pages are existing simultaneously, there's nothing saying that this corner of this page might not come over and touch the corner of this page. And if that's the case, then that means that someone that was existing in the past before you were even born somehow, because this page would be infinitely long either way, as well as infinitely deep either way. So it doesn't mean that this page can't come over here and then now you're experiencing someone who existed in the past because the page somehow bends over. So string theory talks about how every particle is made up of a whole bunch of different strings, and these strings vibrate at different wavelengths. If that's true, then each string vibrating at a different wavelength, if that string starts vibrating a little differently than what it was vibrating, it could, in essence, because of the change of vibration, it could bring something from the past into the future, or vice versa, something from the future into the past. But since we live on a very linear time view in this 3D dimension, we don't actually think we go back in time, But I mean, if each one of these is a different dimension, you're literally a dimensional traveler, because you're traveling through dimensions as you travel through all of these pages. If you're in the middle of these pages, you can more easily gravitate to this side of the book or this side of the book than what you can gravitate to this side of the book if you're here. If you're on the first page, you can't very easily get all the way to the last page. But if you're in between the book, it's more likely you're gonna get to the first sheet or the last sheet because you're closer. I'm not saying that ghosts are real or they're not real. I mean, people say that they're able to take scientific instruments and they're able to measure ghostly encounters, and they're saying that they can prove that ghosts do exist. With multiple dimensions existing, and they're all existing simultaneously, hence everything's predetermined because everything is living in a bell curve within your life. And since you're living inside of that bell curve, yes, there's things that aren't possible for you, but you can move through your bell curve and move yourself to the outer limits of the possibilities for that life. So it's almost like hopping through the pages. So you can get from page 1 to the last page. It takes you a longer period of our time, because if you think about it, you're living your life. As you're jumping pages at different points in your life going this way. So the reason your choices matter is because if you're continuously making the choices that leads you towards the last page, your life is going to be completely different than what if you're just jumping from the first page to the second page and back and forth again. Inside the middle pages is your highest point of your bell curve, and then the first page and the last page are the outer limits of your bell curve. This booklet, it's almost like it's infinite, just like a piano could be infinite. Like you could put infinitely as many octaves as you want and make that piano as big as you want, but we don't. We shrink the octaves down to a point where there's only so many octaves on a piano because we only want the piano to be so big. It's just like the book. The book is only going to be technically a certain size. You're going to reach a limit of places you cannot get because the probability is 0. So if the probability on the inside of the bell curve is almost 100% and on the outside it's 0%, I mean, if you get to the outside at the 0%, you're going to be existing on the very boundary lines of what you could exist. So I mean, once you get there, I mean, I don't know, maybe a completely different bell curve would open up for you. I mean, but maybe by the time you get to that outer limit of where you could be, maybe you've lived long enough where you end up dying in all realities. So you can kind of think of the probability of the lives that you're living as collapsing the older that you get. So I mean, when you were younger, maybe there was like 100 billion possibilities of lives you could be living. And as you're going through those lives, those possibilities are going to be dying. If you go through one direction, it's like if you die in reality, it's almost like, you know, you have this book and then that page gets ripped out, right? So you lose a couple of possibilities, but you could be on either side of that possibility. The longer you live in your life, the less probabilities that you have left over, because probabilities that you did have are going to no longer exist for you. How many different vibrations do you have on the Hertz scale? It's almost infinite, and eventually you're gonna get to a high enough Hertz sound where you can't hear it no more, but other beings and other animals per se are gonna be able to hear that vibration, right? So your life is the same thing. So I mean, sometimes those vibrations could, you know, collide with each other and could somewhat overlap a little bit. You can only have so many different notes in a scale. I mean, the multiverse is the same way. And like I said, when you talk about quantum physics, if you think about water and you think about the ocean, that's the most easy way to understand it. In the ocean, how many gazillions of drops of water are there in the ocean? And they're all moving separately, but at the same time, they're all moving in unison. All the particles that exist on our world and in our universe are doing the same thing. It's just a big ocean of energy that we're basically living in or living on. So each particle's kind of doing its own thing, but it's still, to a certain degree, it's entangled with every other particle. So it's not in literal contact with every other particle, but because eventually, if you follow enough particles, you're gonna find a particle way out of the way over there, and even though it's not anywhere near this particle, they're still connected, because if this one goes up, then this one over here has to eventually go up too. The link is eventually going to affect this one. In essence, every particle in our entire world is connected, and it can't get away from being connected. And every particle has its own little bell curve of possibilities where it could be at any given time. But I mean, you can't literally jump from one Bell probability way outside of a 0% probability. That's why science can basically guess where a particle is going to be at any given time, because it can only go within the certain probability, and eventually the probability hits zero, that it can't be any further than that. But I mean, like I said, once you go to measure it, it breaks down to one probability, because that's what our observation does, is it takes the ocean of probabilities and breaks it down to one. Just like if you stick an eyedropper into the ocean, you have no idea what drop of water you're gonna get, but you can have an idea of what drop of water you're gonna get based on what part of the ocean you're sticking your eyedropper in. So that's kind of the conclusion that quantum physics is coming to. I hope that makes more sense now than it did before. I know the talk maybe wasn't as much about ghosts as what you thought it was going to be, but in my mind, that's basically the gist of explaining why ghosts could exist. Because I mean, when you see a ghost, it might not be able to affect anything around you, but yet you can still see it. So it can pass through things that you consider solid objects, but it's because it's not here. It's where it is. If you watch the movie The Others, that was a great movie, and I actually really enjoyed that movie because it explains this concept wholeheartedly. So in the movie, there's a mom and she has children. She's living in this house, and the father goes away to war. And the whole movie is going through her kids and hers ghostly encounters while she's living in this house. So she's tried to leave the house. As she's trying to leave the house, the fog gets really, really thick to the point where she can't go any further. So she ends up turning around and coming back to the house. They're having all these like paranormal experiences inside of the house, and they're living their lives. It comes to the end of the movie and you find out that her and her kids were actually the ghosts, and she's thinking she's living a normal life in the house, but meanwhile new people moved into the house and they're living in her old house, and they're being haunted by her and her kids. So that's kind of a really good analogy of what's happening in the multiverse. So literally in one dimension, she is living her life normally because she's alive, and that frequency is sometimes interacting with the frequency where she's not alive and she's not living in that house, so someone else is living in that house, and the frequencies overlap in different spots of the house at different times, and I mean sometimes they don't overlap at all, so I mean there's no ghostly encounters, and then you get to a certain point where they're overlapping again, and boom, in a certain room you got a certain ghostly encounter. And I mean, whether you're in that room or not in that room, the ghostly encounter is still happening. It's just that you don't know the ghostly encounter's happening because you're not in the room. But when you're in the room, you know. It's kind of the old adage, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody around to hear it, does it actually make a noise? If there's no one around to hear it, then obviously no, it doesn't make a noise, because you need an observer to experience it for it to actually exist, right? If there's no observer to experience it, then even though something happened and there was a change, it technically didn't happen. It's kind of a weird catch-22. That's where that adage comes from, right? And it's all about vibrations. Like, I'm trying to just explain that everything is vibration. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's an actual chemical reaction. Each different chemical literally has a different vibration because it's got a different amount of particles orbiting the nucleus. They're orbiting in different degrees compared to the nucleus. So I mean, you end up literally, you have a different vibration in that particle. The particle's different. It's going to be a completely different material. So with that being said, like, I feel that maybe I didn't cover everything, or maybe I didn't explain everything perfectly or properly. Like, I feel like something's missing. But at the same time, I think that's a really good introduction to anybody who knows nothing about quantum physics. Maybe it does explain it better to you, so that when you do come across any information about quantum physics, maybe you can understand it better now in the future. If not, then maybe you can start to understand it better. I mean, I've done a lot of studying, and I've had to think about things for long periods of time to be able to come to these understandings and come to these conclusions. So I mean, if you're not putting any energy into understanding it, then you're never going to understand it. The only way you're ever going to come to a higher understanding of these topics is if you put the energy in and you think about it. So that kind of goes back to the law of attraction that I was talking about before. When I was talking about different realities, I was talking about how the choices that you make literally will determine if you go to a new page or if you don't go to a new page. So I mean, your understanding of quantum physics might be right here right now, and you might want your understanding to be over here. So I mean, the only way to get from here to there is to make choices based on learning quantum physics. So I mean, the more choices you make about learning it and thinking about it, I mean, eventually you're going to migrate from here to this end of the book where you understand more about quantum physics. But if you don't take that original step and think about quantum physics to begin with, then you're not going to leave the first page. You're going to stay on it, and you can think of life in the same way. That's why if you want to be a doctor, you can become a doctor. Even if you didn't have good grades in high school, you could still put in the effort that you need and get what you need to be able to become the doctor that you want to be. But you got to put in the effort. And that's why things aren't predetermined in your life and in your existence right now, even though everything is predetermined. Like, all the options are there for you. Everything is existing simultaneously. You can go from where you are right now and go to where you want to go to. And I mean, the only thing that's limiting you, in essence, is the zero probability. That zero probability exists because there's things that you would never become because you're not interested in that in this life. There's lots of people that will never understand anything about quantum physics, and that might be their zero probability because they don't want to know about quantum physics. So I mean, if quantum physics is your zero probability, then you're never going to learn about quantum physics. You can still make the choice to start learning about quantum physics, and like I said, maybe once you make that choice, that even though it doesn't interest you, or even though you don't like it, and even if it's a zero probability for you, maybe you can in essence start a new probability curve by going outside of your original probability curve. I mean, if that's possible, then it opens up way more possibilities for us, rather than just being limited to the one particular little bell curve, right? If it's something that doesn't interest you, you're probably never going to get involved in it in your life. And if you are interested in quantum physics, then I suggest that you spend more time thinking about it, because the more you think about it and the more you throw it back and forth in your own head, sometimes the more you throw it back and forth with someone that's like-minded, I mean, the more likely you are to come to conclusions and to understand things. I hope this explains some things about the law of attraction and about ghosts and about alternate universes. I hope it's all clear and makes sense to you. I mean, I might do some more videos in the future about topics like this, because I've always been interested in it, and it's topics that I want to study and keep thinking about myself. I just want to help people understand the things that they're interested in. I want to try to dumb things down and make things a little bit more easy to understand, because when you're watching a lot of the things or reading books about quantum physics, it can be very technical, and the technicalities of it might be what's throwing you off from learning more about it. The more technical something gets, the harder it is to understand what it's actually trying to say, and the more you gotta break it down to its simplest parts. So I mean, I'm trying to break this down to its simplest parts to give people a good basis, place where they can start at, a place where when you start listening to a scientist that's talking all technically on the topic, you can actually hopefully start to hear and start to look into all the little intricacies that he's actually saying, because you're slowly developing your understanding of it. That's one thing that I found that I've been able to do in my life, is that when I hear someone talking about something I don't understand, I'm able to pick it apart piece by piece and kind of break it down to its simplest dimensions eventually. I mean, sometimes I gotta watch videos over and over and over again to break down those different parts. That's why you can watch a video 100 times, and every time you've watched it you see something different. It's because you'll get one point in your head, you'll mull it over in your mind for a long time, and it won't make sense. Eventually you break it down to a point where it does make sense. So now, because that makes sense, when you go watch the video again, all of a sudden another point comes up. You're like, oh, I understand that point. And then you think about it, and I mean, it's just an eventual progress from knowing nothing to knowing something. And I mean, you can do this with anything that you're interested in, or anything that you're not interested in your life. That's why spirituality, or the law of attraction, says anybody can become anything. It's just a matter of what you put your attention to. So, but you need to have the action. If you don't put in the action and you don't put in the time, you're not going to progress towards that particular outcome. Probability curves, when it comes to atoms and particles, they do move and they do fluctuate, and you can move yourself and your probabilities into a space that you absolutely hate, or into a space that you are not attracted to. It's just a matter, if you put the attention there, you'll get there. You just need to keep putting consistent attention into that. Like I said, I'm gonna try to break this down some more in future videos. I hope this made sense. If it didn't make sense and you need more clarity on anything, I mean, I will answer questions, and I mean, I will sometimes make videos based on comments, like information that people want more of. But hopefully this is a good start for you. Hopefully you understand more now than what you did before about quantum physics, and hopefully this opens up the door for you to more easily be able to learn about quantum physics in the future. And I hope it opened up some people's minds about the possibilities, because I mean, some people are so close-minded about ghosts and the existence of ghosts that they won't even allow themselves to even think that there's any possibility of ghosts existing. When you think about it in this way, like the book of pages and the sheets, and I mean how the sheets are so close together and there's just a tiny little bit that's separating the two sheets. I mean, when you think about it that way, those sheets can touch at any given time. Once you have it touching, there's an overlap and an overlay. Like those pages, they're not sitting still. They are literally vibrating. So eventually those pages are going to touch and realities are going to overlap, and you're literally moving through dimensions on a daily basis. Like, you're a dimensional traveler, and the things you're thinking about now and the attention, like the places you're putting your attention to right now, that's going to determine which page you end up on in the future. I hope this makes sense to you. There's going to be a lot more studying that I have to do into this topic, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more studying that you have to do in this topic too. But I hope that was a good start for you, and I hope it explains some things. I hope it opens up your mind to new possibilities, and I look forward to doing more videos for you in the future. I hope you have a great day. Bye.